Hey everyone, Pastor Scott here. We are kicking off our new study of the Bible narrative this week here at the church. And so we're doing a little experiment here. As I mentioned in some communication last week, there's going to be two different approaches to this study. We'll have our in-person Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. Discussion group that will be getting together. Anyone is welcome to join in that and at any time if you want to just pick up a week here or there, or however you want to approach that, you are welcome in any way, shape, or form that you want to join into that. The other is going to be more online to allow people out in the digital realm to join in as well. And this may kind of flux. We're just kind of doing an experiment here to see how things work. Kind of what I'm thinking I'm going to do at this point is just a brief video here towards the beginning of the week to introduce the topics or the discussion and the reading that we're going to look at over the course of that particular week, pose a few questions. That'll probably be more in written form along with this posting that I'm putting on Facebook. And then to allow you to write something up, write a response, whatever, engage in some conversation that way. And then also possibly, I haven't quite figured this out, but I'm kind of thinking in terms of once we get a couple more days down the road, maybe like Thursday, to record another video in case anybody's posted some questions that they're wondering about, and I can just kind of give a quick response to that, or even discussing and kind of recapping what we had talked about in the in-person discussion. But this may morph and change as the week goes, or as time goes on, as we continue through this study. But that's kind of the approach that I'm looking at. So today might be a little bit longer of a introductory video than what we'll see in subsequent weeks, but because I just kind of want to test this out and see how things go. So this particular week, as we are diving in, two different focal points. One will be kind of looking at the Bible itself as a whole, and I'm going to give a little bit of information and background on that, and then we'll actually jump into the readings that are planned for this particular week. So the focal point, if you want to just skip this introductory stuff that I'm going to do, we're going to be looking at the creation story, which is Genesis 1 and 2. The first two chapters of Genesis is what we'll be looking at this week. So that's kind of where we're at. Again, look for those questions that I'll post. I've got about 3 or 4 questions that I'll post down there just to kind of get you thinking in terms of what might be going on. But to back up now, let's look at the Bible itself. Now, the Bible, or what we know as the book of the Bible, is probably better described as a library of many, many, many different writings. I really should know this. I want to say there's 66 books of the Bible between what we call the Old Testament, or sometimes you'll hear it called the Hebrew Bible, and then the New Testament that really focuses in more on the life of Jesus and the subsequent writings that came after that. But the Bible was written, or what we call the Bible now, was written in two main languages, Hebrew and Greek, with some Aramaic thrown in as well. And it was written on 3 different continents, Europe and Asia and Africa, what we call now, and it was written, compiled over the course of a couple thousand years. So all of the various writings in the Bible are what have come together into the Bible now. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of different stuff in there that's all kind of woven into one. Now, the stories or the narrative that we're going to be focusing on, they originated in oral tradition within the Jewish culture. That were just stories that were passed down, stories of what had come before, stories that helped shape them into how they see the world, how God interacts with the world. All of this was passed down from person to person to person for a long, long, long time before it was actually recorded and put together. What we would call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and specifically the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus I skipped, and then Deuteronomy. And those are the first 5. They are really a combination of when they came together, a combination of 4 different types of writing, thought to be 4 different quote unquote authors, but really kind of coming from a different perspective. Some is more priestly, some is referred to more like kingly. I forget what all they are. It's been a long time since I've studied that. But so there's 4 different perspectives, and at some point, all of these different writings were, they call redacted. Well, yeah, but brought in together, and redacted doesn't sound like the right word, but they were all brought in together and kind of mixed up. So this is why we will tend to see different, slightly different takes on the same story. For instance, the first two books, or excuse me, the first two chapters are two different stories of creation. Similarities, but differences, as we'll see as we get into our reading this week. But so that is kind of what's happening there in terms of what that is. But the whole thing was finally compiled, again, as we talk about the whole Bible, various writings. You may have heard something called the Apocrypha, which is different scripture that we don't consider part of our canon. But the canon of the Bible, as we have it today, really came into, ooh, things just got really bright there, really came into being about 500 years ago. In fact, Martin Luther had a part of that conversation of really solidifying what's going to still be in the scriptures. It was over the course of several different big church-wide councils that determine what would become the canon and what would be the scripture. But it features many different writing styles, and this is something that's really, really important to take note. You know, there's poetry, there's census data, there's songs, there's the gospel stories, there's letters that we hear, there's the prophetic writings, and then there's just plain old narrative that's all tied in together. So, and there's more than that too. The Bible is a culmination of many, many different types of writing styles. And maybe one of the questions that we always need to think about when we're reading it is, what is the truth that is revealed here? Not necessarily like what is the data that is given to me, but what is the truth that's being revealed? One of the things you've maybe heard me talk about before is the importance of a 4-chapter story if we're going to talk about the overarching narrative of what is being revealed within the Bible. And the way I say that, God made it, humanity messed it up, Jesus redeemed it, and we've been invited into the work of reconciling it. So that's kind of the real short, brief synopsis of what the Bible is about, but that's kind of some information about it. So if you have thoughts or questions just on the Bible itself, sure, throw that into the comments or into what you might write up, and we'll go from there on that. I want to shift gears now into talking just a little bit about Genesis 1 and 2, the creation story. Now, I got to give a little bit more history. It is thought that the oldest book of the Bible, or the first one written, is Exodus. And Exodus really speaks of the story of where did the culture of, we can call it Hebrew, or we call it Jewish, we call it Israelite. Those names are somewhat interchangeable. Where did their culture originate? They originated as a culture, as a people, in slavery in Egypt. But it raises the question, well, how did we get there? And that's really what the book of Genesis talks about. Genesis answers this question. Now, it starts from the beginning of creation, and then we also, of course, have the brokenness of the world, brokenness of humanity. Then there's a lot of generational information, and then we also have the stories of patriarchs and their kind of greater stories, starting with Abraham, then moving on through Joseph and the whole family coming to Egypt, which is how Genesis ends. Though that's a really brief overview of what we'll see over the next several weeks as we stay in Genesis for a while. There's a lot of important stuff in Genesis, but that's kind of what's going on there. Now, when this was written, when the Pentateuch was recorded, is thought to be, according to scholars, during the Babylonian captivity. Now, the Babylonian captivity was roughly the year 700 BC, or BCE, we call it now, before Common Era. So, a long, long, long time after these events would have occurred. But the Israelite people had been dominated by the Babylonian culture, just one of the long line of various times when they'd been conquered and taken over. And their culture was really pushed to the margins, and they had to kind of maintain things themselves, but they were surrounded by Babylonian culture, including the Babylonian religion, which was polytheistic, a lot of gods, a lot of different takes on things. And so as we're talking about creation here at the beginning of Genesis, that was almost an answer to the Babylonian view of creation. Now they had, as I mentioned, many different gods, and their creation story comes about from death and destruction. There was one god named Marduk and another one named Tiamat, and they got in a big battle, and Marduk killed Tiamat and then used the body of Tiamat to create the world. That was the Babylonian view. So creation comes about through death and destruction. What we hear, particularly in the first account of creation in chapter 1, is an answer to that we believe that we have a God who created the world out of joy and delight, not out of death and destruction, but out of a sense of joy and delight in what God was making and bringing chaos towards order. That's really kind of something that comes up with that. Now, the first story is very, very poetic. If you read it before, you know there's kind of a repetition to it, that almost like stanzas of a poem that God says, let there be, and it comes into creation. And sometimes there's a little more information and sometimes there's not. But and then God looks at it, God sees that it's good. And then we have evening and morning the first day, and so on, and second day and third day. So it's this repetition of creation that kind of continues as God continues bringing things towards order. Now, the second story is a very more human-centric type view. The first one is very cosmic, starts great big from 80,000 feet, if we want to say that. The second one seems to be from the ground up, and we see humanity's really sort of at the center of it. And this is an example of those different perspectives that are within the writing itself. From different audience, different intention behind it, and we see that between these two. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at within the discussion that'll happen Wednesday evening this week. Again, I'm going to have some questions posted down. This video got a little bit longer than I anticipate them being in the future, but I'm going to try and keep them more brief as we go on. If you have a lot of questions and comments and things that are posted, as a response, I'll do another video here in a couple more days, and we'll add to that. But otherwise, thank you for joining into this. I look forward to seeing what this turns into, and joining with you as we blaze our way through the Bible narrative. Thanks, everybody.